Andres, and I'm going to mispronounce your last name if you don't say Cuervo?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, who's going to talk to us about Imagine Trees Like These, a virtual reality narrative concerning forest, futurity, and ephemerality. Thanks.
So this is my capstone presentation, Imagine Trees Like These, which will be obvious as we progress. And I'd like to thank the creative writing department for letting me work on such a weird little project, and especially Sylvia Wanhande, my creative writing capstone advisor for this project. So what are we doing? First, we're going to go through a brief history of interactive storytelling. We're going to talk about what virtual reality is, what I did with it, some future directions for this work, and any questions that you might have. So what qualifies as interactive storytelling? There are a few different definitions, and that can depend on sort of discipline or medium. And because this was a creative writing project, I chose products that from interactive storytelling that affected me personally. And something that was interesting through the process of considering what affected me personally, maybe the earliest example of interactive storytelling and a way that we don't usually consider it would be pop-up books, where as you go through the narrative, you actually have a hand in literally creating the environment that represents the narrative. And a more mature version of this would be things like choose your own adventure books, where you still have a pretty primitive linear narrative, but you have a hand in choosing how the plot turns out. And at least personally, this was the first time that I felt like I had agency within a narrative. So books are cool, but probably more relevant to my project would be something like video games. And while they weren't personally formative for me, the most analogous thing I can think of from the world of something like choose your own adventure books would be text-based adventure games, where you would enter a command like go left or pick up the lamp, and the game would read out to you the description, a description of the effect that took on the world. And we sort of made the transition from these first text-based digital games to more graphical early video games through a bunch of examples. The most personally formative probably for me would be the game on the right, Pokemon Yellow, which is the first video game I ever played. And games like Donkey Kong, or for example Tetris or Pac-Man, a lot of very iconic games that came out of the 80s and 90s, ended up giving us graphical representations of a small, usually interactive narrative that allowed us to represent things using a 2D grid, and that's really important. All the imagery you see in early video games is represented by flat pixels, which will change. So probably the biggest transition from early video games to modern video games, not so early video games, is the transition from 2D to 3D. Computers become powerful enough to actually represent depth in a much more realistic way, giving us things like this cutscene, for example, from Call of Duty, where you see light being represented, you see very realistic skin texture, you see a lot of detail that you just wouldn't have been able to represent in earlier models of computing. Along with this graphical complexity, we get something like interactive complexity, where we get a lot of people playing the same game at once, playing against each other, and it not only looks good, but there's dozens of options, dozens if not hundreds of options for how to interact with the game, whether that's moving or summoning an attack, etc. So the hallmark of modern games is really interactive and graphical complexity. And that relates to virtual reality, and that we can see it as a sort of extension of that graphical progression. And to understand where we are in virtual reality, we can take something like this typical map of the world, which is called the Mikado projection. It's the Earth, which is a 3D object, a sphere mapped onto a 2D object, which we can see by the grid. So it's a perfect 2D object, but there are actually some weird distortions. For example, Greenland at the top in light is actually pretty small in landmass, but represented here, as you typically see it, it actually looks pretty similar to the landmass of the United States. And this is wrong because we've represented a 3D object in 2D space. And so we can correct this by going into VR, which effectively allows us, in a simplified model, it allows us to wrap something like a 2D grid back onto a sphere. And that's a pretty unintuitive concept. But this hopefully helps visualize where we are in space. And we are directly in the center of the sphere like this, where we are in the middle of a grid. And this actually ends up looking something like this, which is the same image, except we've mapped it onto the inside of the sphere using a program called A-Frame. And in this representation, we can see that Greenland is now appropriately small when compared to the United States. So we've successfully mapped this image back into a sphere. And we can interact with it as if we're spatially resonant with it, rather than through some sort of simple top-down or even flat 2D means. So I took this concept and I extended it a little bit. I wanted to add something like the concept of state. So for my interpretation, state means that an object has a memory or some sort of knowledge about what it's supposed to be doing within the scene. So we can actually see that this is a 360-degree scene, but there's really nothing else to do here besides look at these objects and press one of these buttons. So right now they're in their default state, but we can press this little panic button, and the circle sort of, or sphere sort of freaks out, grows a little bit, and we can reset the state. And we can sort of toggle between these two states. And I used this little scene as a proof of concept for sort of establishing what I consider to be the canvas of my narrative, using state and putting that in 360 degrees is sort of the basis for how I wanted to represent the narrative. And I had a few goals for this narrative. First, I wanted it to be abstract. A lot of my inspiration was linear narratives, even sort of choose your own adventure or textual choice video games are still branching linear narratives, and I just thought it would be an interesting personal choice to create an abstract narrative. Along with that, there's this effort to make virtual reality very much sort of cinematic, hyper-realistic representation of the world. And while we gain a lot out of that, we also can, I think, gain a lot out of making a sort of pseudo-virtual anti-reality, making it very explicit that we're not in the real world. And simply because it's an interesting, another interesting personal decision, I wanted to take this very unnatural space and use it to talk about something natural, namely in this case trees, which I was using as a proxy for the idea of nature, which is sort of transparent, but allows us to talk about a very simple idea in a very non-intuitive scene. And finally, a lot of the inspiration, just personally for me, comes from geometric and futuristic designs, whether that's like things like generative geometry or the aesthetics of futurism. I let a lot of that bleed through to my visual style. And that's pretty apparent if we go through building the scene. So when I started, it was just this white canvas. The pink dot at the center, or circle at the center, is supposed to represent your cursor, so much like a mouse on a computer screen that represents where you're interacting currently. And it's supposed to represent where you're looking if you were to put this into a headset, for example. I added a 360-degree photo of the Oberlin Arboretum, because it fit well with the scene. I animated some color into the background of that, and this is true in 360 degrees as well, as we'll see in a bit. I animated this little sun, what I call a sun, but is actually just a really weird abstract circle in the background. We can actually take a closer look at it. So all it's doing is it has a bunch of segments, and it looks sort of like a circle when it has all its segments, and then it animates down to just 3 segments, such that it looks like a triangle. And I really didn't have an intention behind this. I just wanted another point of visual interest. I added some trees, and we'll explore what they do in a moment. and I added some cones to introduce us to the concept of what we're supposed to do in this world. And finally, I added a title screen to make the scene less overwhelming when you first enter it. So what does this all look like put together? So this is my capstone, embedded, and you can see that really all you can do when you start is take a look at this text and interact with this scene. So we place the cursor over this for a second, and it breaks away to reveal the scene underneath. And hopefully your line of sight leads you to these cones, which begin to animate whenever you intersect with them. And really the only intention here is that you're supposed to get a sense that these are weird little cones that have that animate and change whenever you interact with them. And you can stare at them or not stare at them for however long you like. There's no direction in this narrative. You're supposed to get out of it what you want. I didn't animate the sun, so really the only thing that's left to look at in this world are the trees. And when we look at them from afar, we can see that they're animating a little bit. They're sort of obscured by the cursor. It's sort of difficult to tell what's happening. And in this position, they're sort of believable. They're at a weird perspective where they look like they're just tiny trees in the background. But then as they begin turning counterclockwise, we see that they start floating. And this, while it was sort of a technical difficulty, I decided to keep it in. I decided to not map it to the actual texture of the world to make it achieve that anti-reality idea of like making it very apparent that we're just not in physical space, that we're in a very strange little world. And finally, as we've turned fully around, we reach this last cluster of trees, which are so close that when we look at them, it actually jumps out at the viewer. And hopefully that interaction sort of inspires this idea that nature is just coming out and literally touching, intersecting with the viewer. And now we've gone all the way around. And there's a lot that I could continue to do with this, but I really intended for this to be an abstract playground, to be an expression of a few simple ideas combined into a little scene. So there are many ideas that I have, but I'm going to present just two for future work. It's possible to animate things along the path, and so I think I'd be interested in whenever you look at a tree, having it sort of come towards the viewer and having the interaction be a little bit more personalized, or at the very least just closer to the viewer. Right now I use some pretty strange physics. In fact, I don't use any physical modeling. So I think it'd be interesting to introduce actual physics, not as a replacement, but to have cartoony physics and actual physics sort of living alongside each other, to introduce another element of contrast into the narrative. And that's it. That's my capstone. Thank you.
Any questions?
About 20 years ago, when people became familiar with the web, there was a flurry of hyperfiction where people were trying to use hypertext to create narrative, nonlinear narrative. And the trouble with that is that it was really hard to get emotional content out of the story because you could take so many different paths through it. By using virtual reality and things like that, do you think you can put some emotional content into something like this?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people's idea of what reality brings is intensity. Especially if we were viewing it still on a 2D screen, but especially when you put something like this into a headset, you're both isolated and immersed into the world. And I think it would really force emotionality back onto a narrative like that, and that's definitely something I want to explore.
I'm curious how you view kind of the development of like VR storytelling and the like projected trajectory as analogous to some of the early examples. Like where are we in VR compared to like the trajectory of like, I don't know, probably video games is the only one that makes sense to kind of draw a parallel with, because like I don't think there was very much of like a huge trajectory in like, I don't know, choose your own adventure books or whatever. But yeah, I'm just curious if you could comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, so we're definitely in the earliest stages, and at the point where work like this is interesting explicitly because it parallels that journey where early video games were much more exploratory simply because we didn't have conventions built around things. And so right now we're simply building conventions. We're figuring out what it means to model a hand in virtual space, and whether or not that's completely disorienting to someone. It turns out it is. And so since we're at that very primitive stage, we're also at a place where storytelling looks like this. It looks like the really abstract, strange little things and experiments. And hopefully, as we figure out conventions that don't make people like sort of get dizzy, we'll be able to have more concrete and more emotionally impacting stories.
Curious if you explored augmented reality as well as virtual reality, or just
Yeah, so I'm really interested in web-based frameworks, and the problem with that is that a lot of browsers, especially on your phone, don't have access to the camera. So while I'm really excited for augmented reality, the only avenue for it right now is app-based, and I've tried a little bit of that. But the most accessible version for me to do in a semester was virtual reality. But I definitely think augmented reality presents a whole other set of really, really interesting and possibly even more emotionally impacting surfaces, literal surfaces to tell a story on.
Okay, thank you. I see another moderator sort of lurking out there behind the door, but I want to thank all of you for your creative work. Thank you for